The Pope's Astronomer. I know it's not your official title, but it's a cool title. Where does that come from?
I don't know where people started using that in the first place. Kings had astronomers in the past. Maybe that might be what it's about. It's a shorthand way of saying that I'm not just an astronomer, but I'm an astronomer with an interesting position, with an interesting job. Being the director of the observatory, I'm only one of a dozen astronomers, but I'm the only one that's directly appointed by the Pope. The real thing, I think, is to remind people that astronomy is the kind of thing you can't make a living at unless you have a patron. And in this case, my patron is the Pope, and that shows the world that the Church is interested in astronomy.
The nickname gives the impression that the Pope would occasionally consult you on astronomical matters. Has it ever happened? Have you ever got a phone call from a Pope saying, I was wondering about this or that?
The closest that ever came was when a Pope, and I won't even be more specific than that, was going to be talking to astronauts. And you always have to have some prepared statement, and could I prepare something for him to say? Or even things that might be topics that, of course, what happens with all of these world leaders is that they meet so many people day in and day out, they can't prepare their talks ahead of time. So generally, somebody says, here are some talking points. And I did that once when one of the popes was talking to astronauts.
You've served under 3 popes, I believe? What is your interaction with popes then?
It's actually very limited. We don't run into each other in the hallway. As the director, I'm part of the big audience every Christmas with all the members of the Curia, where you have assigned seatings, and my seat is in the back row off in the corner. But, I'm in the room, that's something. That said, the times when I have interacted, when I've been in one of these audiences, it's kind of scary to say he knows who I am. He knows my name. He knows my background. And I guess that means I can't hide. But it's also, it's an honor.
The 3 popes that you have served under, do they have any interest in astronomy as far as you know? Do they have much of a knowledge of astronomy?
It varied, of course, varies from pope to pope. The one that everybody can cite has had a great interest in astronomy was Pius XII. He was himself something of an amateur astronomer. And that would sometimes get him into trouble as he would make offhand comments about astronomy that he had 90% right and the 10% wrong. Then you have to go, well, it's actually like this. I'll say of the 3 that I worked with, John Paul II was an academic. And so he appreciated academic work and the value of academic work in and of itself. On the other hand, the one time we showed him images we had made of Comet Shoemaker-Levy, he sort of looked at him and said, bless you, bless your comets, and that's about it. When Benedict came to visit, he was full of questions about the meteorites, about the work we did, very specific. He was, and is, a brilliant, brilliant man. The other thing that everyone is surprised about Benedict, he also has a wicked sense of humor. And he was able to trade jokes, academic kinds of jokes about orders of magnitude and things like that, which showed that he was definitely following and knew what was going on. Francis has a background in chemistry. He'd worked in chemistry before he became a Jesuit. And as a Jesuit, he's got the academic background. So he's certainly well aware of what we're doing. The thing that I think shows the depth of Francis's knowledge is Laudato Si', that encyclical he wrote, which not only gets the science right, but he gets what the science really is. It's not just a listing of facts. It's not just, this is the mechanism. What does it mean? What does it mean in a human sense? What does it mean to us, who will always be a little bit wrong, but we're always striving for the truth? So it gets past the absolutism of the science you learned in high school, where you get the answer in the back of the book, and that's what science is. Well, no, it isn't. And he gets that.
Why does the Vatican have an astronomical observatory?
There's a short answer and a long answer, and I'll give you something in between. Really, astronomy was one of those things that you studied in the medieval universities, along with geometry and arithmetic and music. And it was a sense that you have to know how the universe works before you can then philosophize about it or do theology about it. One of the bizarre and wonderful things about the people of the book, the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, is that unlike a lot of religions, we think the physical universe was made by God, and therefore it's a good thing to study. The physical world is not a morass that's designed to trap you into evil. Chocolate is not there to lure you into obesity. Chocolate is a foretaste of the joy of heaven. That's at least my theology. And that means that studying the physical universe, in particular cosmology or astronomy, is certainly a way of getting used to the way that God works. There is also the practical side of things, a lot of festivals, a lot of the Jewish holidays, and then from them the Christian holy days, were based on the calendar. Easter was the first Sunday after Passover. Passover was based on the phase of the moon in the beginning of the year. That, of course, is why the popes hired astronomers back in the 1580s to reform the calendar. The modern observatory dates from 1891. At that time, for the first time in almost 1,000 years, the Vatican was faced with two very different problems. The idea that somehow studying science, studying the physical universe was against religion instead of in favor of it, which was a 19th century idea, and which was being pushed by people who thought that, science is going to solve all of our problems. Steam engines and electricity and eugenics. Oh, Lord. The church wanted to say, no, that's not what science is. Science is not against religion, but there's certainly bad things you can do with technology. Technology is not the same thing as science. Nobody doubts that atomic bombs work because of fusion of atomic particles. But that doesn't mean we can't argue about whether atomic bombs are a good idea. The other problem the Vatican was faced with was that after 1870, rather than having its own independent nation in the center of Italy, it was reduced to just that area around St. Peter's, and the Italians didn't even recognize them as an independent nation. Having a national observatory was a way of being recognized as a nation. So it had this theological sense, and it also had this practical political sense. By the time of Pius XI in the 1920s and 30s, you find statements where studying astronomy will lead you to prayer and lead you to an appreciation of God. By the time you get to John Paul II, he sees science and religion as equal partners in the goal of looking for truth. And suddenly science has a very different role than just being a useful tool. What Francis has done is to carry that one step further and to recognize that science is a human activity. It's not the universe. It's how we humans try to understand the universe and what that does to us as humans.
You talk about having an observatory being useful because astronomy can help inform theology. But it sounds like, the popes aren't picking up the phone and taking advantage of this resource that they have here. They don't have to have you, do they, to inform their theology? Well, then it seems like a resource they're not utilizing.
If it was simply a one-on-one connection, that would be true. But in fact, it's two communities talking to each other. It's the community of all theologians. It's the community of all scientists. And we are along that boundary. There's, a dozen of us doing a dozen different things. So that under John Paul II, for instance, at his insistence, the Vatican Observatory began a series of conferences on the nature of divine action in the physical universe. So that we began this collaboration with an institute in California called the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, published a bunch of deep theological books that people are still referencing. Oh, a lot of the stuff that I do is popularization. I'm standing up here with a Roman collar and an MIT ring. This is an MIT ring, it's not a bishop's ring, don't kiss it. I write articles for newspapers in Italy, in America, in England, and I show up on things like this. At the end of the day, by existing, we remind the scientists that religion is not their enemy. Even more, we remind the religious people that science is not their enemy.
Does that mean this department of astronomers that's here exists a lot because of public relations? It's like a PR move as well.
Public relations is basically all of life. My father was a public relations man, one of the founders of the Public Relations Society of America. I grew up as a child knowing what public relations really is. It's important to have that boundary, that glue between the institution that knows what it's trying to do and the people who have a way that they want to be able to refer to and communicate with that institution. And so I'm very proud to say that's absolutely what we're doing.
Why astronomy? Why isn't there a little math department or a chemistry department or genetics? Why does the Vatican have an astronomy department?
First of all, the Vatican's a dinky place. The entire annual budget of the Vatican would pay for 1.5 Hollywood movies a year. It's not very much. And our budget is 0.5% of that. So there's not a whole lot of money to do science. Historically, there happened to be astronomers available when they thought they should have some kind of national scientific institute, and national observatories were the sorts of things that a government would support because nobody else would. There is this inevitable gut connection between studying the sky and studying things outside of our mundane life. And that means that by being in this science, we can both explain why we're not really studying the same thing because we're experts in both and we know the difference, but also to remind us that we do astronomy just as we pray for something bigger than to fill our stomach, for something bigger than to get ourselves prestige, that we're doing it because we're hungry for something more than what goes into our stomach, because we don't live by bread alone. That's literally true. I discovered that working in the Peace Corps in Africa, that people who were hungry were also hungry for knowledge, were hungry for respect, were hungry for the opportunity to think and feed their imaginations and their knowledge.
Surely you must see some fundamental clashes between the very underlying principles of science and the very underlying principles of religion. Like if you said to me, Brady, tell me what religion is, very quickly I would start talking about faith and a belief in things that can't be seen or tested.
Like black holes, like electrons. What are these things that we can't see?
No, because black holes, even when we can't see them, we refuse to believe they exist until we see them, and we spend a lifetime trying to find proof of them and evidence of them and image them. We don't do that to God. Like, the aim of religion is not to spend the next 100 years trying to find evidence of God or image God or find a horizon around him. We have to just accept he's there. Whereas science is all about saying, I will not accept until I can test or look for it.
Oh my goodness. What you've described is exactly what religion is. And what you've described is exactly what science isn't. I'll give you 3 axioms. Every logical system has to believe in axioms. You have to take as assumptions, this is how the world works, before you can do logic. It's Gödel's theorem. And to believe in science, you have to believe that the physical universe is real. Not every religion believes that. It's not just illusion, that there is actually an underlying reality, no matter how bad our senses are. You have to believe that it obeys laws. Who was the first person to think that there were laws in science? Well, what's the alternative? Oh, the nature god's doing this and the nature god's doing that. But Christianity doesn't take nature gods. It says there are laws. And you have to believe it's worth doing. That studying the physical universe, even if it's not going to make me rich, is nonetheless a worthwhile thing for grown-ups to do. Those are axiomatic. If you don't accept them, you won't be an astronomer. You have to take those on faith. Likewise, religion only begins because you have experienced what is, for lack of a better phrase, a religious experience. Something real happened, whether it's holding a newborn for the first time in your life, dealing with the death of a loved one, or just that walking down the street and suddenly you're out of nowhere hit and overwhelmed with a feeling, an emotion, a desire that you can't put your finger on what that's about. And then you say, okay, how do I deal with this? How have people dealt with it in the past? What works, what doesn't? And just like science, you don't want to try to make it all up on your own. You don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. You want to find out what has worked for other people in the past. An awful lot of religion only makes sense as you get older and you experience something and you go, that's what they were talking about. But the trouble is, so many people stop learning religion when they were 12 and don't carry that into the rest of their lives, just as too many people stop learning science when they were 12, and they think that science is getting the answer in the back of the book, when it's anything but that. It is living with the mystery and continually understanding it so that you go, oh, that's what they mean by an electron. I never understood it that way before. Science always comes up with better descriptions, knowing that better descriptions yet are to come. Science doesn't prove. Math proves. Science doesn't. Science is not mathematics. And even the things that we've assumed, conservation of energy, what's fundamental, except conservation of energy doesn't work in atomic physics. And then you've got to have something else maybe being conserved. And likewise, doubt is essential to religion. Doubt is essential to faith. The opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty.
So, do you have any doubt that God exists?
Of course, all the time. And I have worries about the science that I do. And I've got all of these theories, many of which I learned from my professors. Gee, is it just a weird coincidence that my professors were always right and the other professors were wrong? I'd better have doubt about that. Because the goal ultimately is to come to truth. The goal isn't to prove I was right, because I wasn't. And I'm never going to be right. Science is a bunch of human-invented explanations for the physical universe. As human inventions, I can always understand them, but they're always going to be a little bit short of the truth. Religion are truths that I have to deal with, but that I will never completely understand. And if I ever think that it's finished and it's done and it's all packaged and it can be in a book, it's dead. And that faith is dead, and that science is dead.
Should humans be striving for evidence of God's existence?
No, I think that's backwards. What you strive for is understanding the experiences of life that we have. And there are different ways you can go about with that understanding. To me, I choose as one of my axioms that there is a God underneath, behind, supporting all of this. And with that axiom, I then try to say, what can I say about this God? How does that make sense of this universe? Does this axiom work? Now, if I come up with a contradiction, my answer is not to throw away the axiom, but to say, I'm about to learn something new. Because, to be honest, I've never encountered a moment where this bit of science contradicted this bit of religion. But I have all the time run into problems where this bit of science contradicted this bit of science. And when the two bits of science don't agree, then I'm about to learn some new science.
But isn't religion kind of designed to avoid that collision with science?
Well, I would also say the same of science. The difference is that they are not competing systems, nor are they competing books of facts, where, oh my gosh, this book says one thing and that book says the other thing, I've got to choose. One is truth, seeking understanding, and the other is understanding, seeking the truth. They're both dealing in the same playing field, but they're playing different games.
Can I ask you a personal question then? If you had to give up science or religion, you had to give one up, which would it be? You said
I couldn't.
You couldn't?
I could not. I could not be who I am. And not any baby who's trying to figure out where its toes are is a scientist. And any baby who is hoping that there will be a meal or somebody to change its diaper is already believing in something outside of itself that it needs. And forget about feed and forget about diaper, the need for love. You cannot be a human being without having both. And this infuriates people when I say this, when other people say this. But everyone has a religion, and everybody is a scientist. Some of us are just really bad at it.
A lot of scientists who I have met over the years, I would describe as atheists, and some I would even describe as being quite hostile to religion. You obviously move in a lot of scientific circles and conferences, and you're an astronomer. Do you ever encounter hostility to being a representative of the Vatican, but also being a representative of science?
Yes, not very often. The people who have been hostile, how can I put this, have been white, elderly, British, males. It's this really narrow group of people who I suspect were brought up with really bad religion classes and, had a horrible experience when they were 14. And the religion they don't believe in, I don't believe in either.
What's their angle of attack?
I haven't encountered enough of them deeply enough to be able to say that I could generalize from that. There are a couple who I think maybe come from stereotypically religious backgrounds and want to break out of that stereotype. They want to say, no, I'm more than just the evangelicals that I grew up with or the whatever. And so I can see that as a sense of attempting to want to assimilate into a larger culture. A lot of it is insecurity. Most fundamentalists of religion or science are insecure. You have to have a certain arrogance to say, I don't know and I can live with that. But I'll tell you the other thing that happened to me, being in America and being an astronomer. When I became a Jesuit, I had already been in the field 15 years. Everybody knew me. They didn't know I was Catholic because it's not one of the things you talk about. And the most common reaction was, I didn't know you go to church. Let me tell you about the church I go to. And I go, I didn't know you go to church either. There's two of us. Don't tell. I think in astronomy, it's a lot more common than other fields. I think biology is probably where you find the largest number of atheists, because the biology is still in the 19th century trying to find the gears and levers of how life works. I understand that. What people have told me is that the proportion of people who identify as atheists or believers isn't so much whether you're a scientist or not a scientist, it's what culture you come from, what is your community, where did you grow up, who are the people you grew up with. The fact is that, religious people have been doing science since science was invented. I've got a copy here. This is one of the volumes of the Philosophical Transactions. So I pulled this one out. It turns out to be 1816.
You pulled it at random, I saw you.
Opening page. Who are the people who are publishing? Sir Humphrey Davy, Frederick Herschel, Humphrey Davy again, the Reverend Abram Robertson, D.D., F.R.S., Doctor of Divinity and Fellow of the Royal Society, Savilian Professor of Astronomy at the University of Oxford, and Radcliffean Observer. You find, if you go looking through the Philosophical Transactions or any of these other 17th, 18th, 19th century books, about a quarter of the people publishing scientific works were the Reverend so-and-so. Who else had the education and the free time to do that kind of work? And for that matter, what does a scientist do actually day to day? You collect data, you sort data, you file data. It's clerical work, right? Why do they call it clerical? It was done by clerics.
Do you think there are any ways in which being a religious person and a man of faith gives you an advantage doing science?
Being at the Vatican gives me a tremendous advantage. I don't have to write grant proposals. Oh my Lord, that's such an advantage. I can do long-term research projects that may take 10 or 15 years to come to fruition. But beyond that, the bigger advantage to me is it reminds me why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it to get tenure. I'm not doing it to show up the guys at Arizona State. I'm not doing it to be rich or famous or any of those other foolish things that would get in the way of being willing to admit I was wrong when I was wrong. I'm doing it ultimately because if I think that science is a way of worshiping God, then it means I have to worship truth. And that has to mean that I know I don't have the truth, because otherwise why would I be looking for it? It has to mean that I'm willing and desirous to hear anybody else who has the truth, whether I like what school they went to or what politics they have.
Let me talk to you about the G word, Galileo.
Mm-hmm.
Surely he is a millstone around your neck, working for the Vatican.
Oh, thank God for Galileo. If he wasn't around, I wouldn't have a job. Because I have an interest in history, because I knew taking this job people were going to ask me about Galileo, I did a lot of reading, I did a lot of research, not only the popular books, but the scientific works. The story, the true history, is fascinating. And it's, so much more complicated and so much more wonderful. And basically everything you know about Galileo is probably wrong. It doesn't make the church look any better. The church screwed up. the popes screwed up. And the two important questions to ask is, how did they screw up and why did they screw up? And what can we learn from that? If you think it was because the church was anti-science, then you're missing the point. That wasn't the problem. The problem was something else. Maybe it was popes using the power of the papacy for their own private revenge. Some people think that. I'm not sure of that. Maybe it was Galileo being tied up in the politics. Did you know that the Galileo trial occurred at the very height of the 30 Years' War, which was the first world war? It involved every nation in Europe. It was a vicious and nasty and horrible war, and the Pope was under phenomenal political pressures, as was Galileo's family supporting him in Florence. Is it just a coincidence that Galileo, who had been a friend of the Pope and had been having great times, suddenly, when all the battles started going in a different direction, found himself in trouble? Maybe it was just a coincidence. The written record only tells you half the story, as any historian can tell you. The stuff that everybody knows so they don't have to write it down is the stuff that we don't know anymore.
If there's one thing that you'd like people interested in this topic to know that maybe they don't know, what is it?
I would love to get across the sense that Galileo was very much a person of his times. He was not a 21st century scientist trapped in the 17th century. And to understand him and the pressures, you have to know he was living at the same time as Cervantes writing Don Quixote, at the same time as Shakespeare's later plays, at the same time as Goya painting in strange new ways. He was at a time of revolution in thought, and the revolution hadn't finished. It was still ongoing. And that's what makes him such a wonderful person, and someone for whom the Catholic Church should well be proud.
Let me talk to you about another thing, the creation story. Are you glad that's in the Bible?
Yes, yes, and I'll tell you why. Where did the creation story come from, the first chapter of Genesis? Where was that written? Well, you can get a hint from the fact that the sort of cosmology they're describing is Babylonian cosmology, even to the point where the Babylonians had this myth that the gods were at war and a dragon died and that by accident created the universe. The name of the dragon in the Babylonian myth is the name for chaos used in Genesis. It's the same word. So it's not that Genesis is repeating the Babylonian myth. Genesis is assuming that whoever's reading this has already heard the Babylonian myth. And what Genesis is saying, here's what's different from the Babylonians. What's different is that it wasn't done by accident. God deliberately says. What's different is that the God who's saying that is already there in the beginning. In the beginning, God. The difference is that rather than it occurring as a chaotic accident, it occurs in a logical step-by-step series of events that can be reasoned out. Every step along the way, the God who is responsible and chose to make this happen says this is good. And here's the best part. The end and the point of the Babylonian myth is to show that the city of Babylon is the greatest thing that's ever going to come along the pike. That's not the point of the Genesis story. Where does the Genesis story end? What is the climax, the ultimate goal of creation? It's not people, that's the sixth day. It's the day of rest. It's the seventh day. It's the day when we stop worrying about how are we going to eat, how are we going to stay warm, and instead we give ourselves a day to think about the bigger questions, to think about who are we, where did we come from, who loves us, what is the source of this love, what is this universe. God created us to be astronomers.
You have this interpretation of the Genesis story, which is poetic or insightful.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people alive today don't have that interpretation. They take it more literally.
Most of the people who take it literally are the atheists who use it as a reason not to believe in God. There are actually very darn few literalist fundamentalists out there, but they seem to get all the press. It happens.
So you think there aren't many people who take it literally, so it doesn't?
Not only that, It's again a sign of fundamentalism. It's a kind of fundamentalism that's afraid to let go of any bit of truth that I have, because they're afraid if they're wrong, God won't love them. You know? Maybe I'm wrong, but God will still love me even though I'm wrong.
Why didn't God, when he inspired the writing of Scripture, give a more
Scientific?
truthful, literal account of what happened?
Oh,
Why didn't God inspire the Bible to say, in the beginning there was nothing except me, and then I did this, and then over 1 billion years this happened, and then over another 1 billion years this happened? Why did he make it seem so fantastical? Not that real creation isn't fantastical, but
That description would have seemed fantastical to anyone up to 50 years ago, and that description would seem primitive in 1,000 years. There is no description other than poetry that could possibly be timeless.
that's quite a good answer. I'll give you that. I liked that answer. I'll remember that one. Tell me about the observatory now. Tell me about the type of science you're doing here.
Well, as I think I'd mentioned before, one of the great advantages working at the Vatican is we don't have to worry about grant proposals. I don't have to show results after 3 years or else I don't get my job. And that means the work that we tend to do complements the work of our colleagues. Everybody at the observatory's got a PhD from a major university someplace. We've all got colleagues we've worked with. We've all got colleagues that we're in a field that we're still continuing to interact with. I'm not going to do the kind of work that somebody else is getting paid to do a lot better than the more money I've got. They've got the better equipment. They've got the bigger department. I'm going to do the work that I can do that supports the bigger project. In our meteorite lab, we happen to have more than 1,000 samples of meteorites, a little bit of every type of meteorite that's out there. We are measuring physical properties, density, porosity, magnetic susceptibility, thermal properties like heat capacity, and just making tables for how these vary among the different types. It's a work of 20 years.
Like kind of almost like grunt work, but
It
skill.
is absolutely grunt work, and yet great science comes out of it. There's been a question of trying to understand stars in clusters soon after they're formed in terms of their spectra, especially because the stars tend to be in dusty parts of the galaxy and the dust interferes with the colors. How can you see through the dust? Well, we've got people here who have worked out using a series of very cleverly chosen filters to be able to characterize the type of a star regardless of the dust that it's going through. It's taken them 20 years to work that out. They've got this system. We're now going and exploring embedded stellar clusters to give us a better idea of essentially the census of the galaxy. Where are the stars being formed now? How are these stars different from stars being formed elsewhere? You can only do that by a survey of lots of different types of stars. Galaxies themselves interact. They collide with each other. They orbit each other. One of our astronomers working with colleagues in America has worked out how the collision of galaxies around the Andromeda galaxy can explain now the stars that we see in the halo around the galaxy, and makes you realize that galaxies are not closed systems. Galaxies interact with each other. They trade stars. They trade material. This seems to be a bigger theme of, we used to think the Earth was a place until we realized stuff is falling in on the Earth. Well, the solar system is a place. Now we're seeing interplanetary objects hitting the solar system. Well, our galaxy is a place. No, we're seeing interactions with other galaxies. The universe is not only a lot bigger than we thought 100 years ago, but it's not isolated. Every bit is eventually chemically and physically touching every other bit.
How much longer are you the Pope's astronomer for?
In times past, you'd be astronomer for life, and that was much too long. The director before me made a rule, a 5-year term, you could renew it for 5 years. My first 5 years are up. Probably I'll get another 5 years, but by then I'll be in my early 70s, and it'll be time to turn it over to somebody else.
What do you hope to achieve before you finish? How do you want this place to be different, or what would make you pleased with your tenure?
What I want it to be, and what I think we've already got, is a place where people want to come and work, where people are happy doing the science they're doing, excited to get up in the morning and go to the lab. And if I can accomplish that, then I can be someone who has made science fun It's really easy for science to become just a job, and a pretty boring job. And you spend most of your time staring at a computer screen wondering, what am I doing? And you forget why you went into it in the first place. You forget the joy that comes. And if I can have the observatory be a source of joy, not only to us, but to our colleagues, to remind the other scientists that at the end of the day, we're in it for the love of it. Ultimately, it's love that makes these things move around. Dante had it right. That's what I hope we can be at the Vatican Observatory.
Make sure you also check out our tour of the papal telescopes. Look at that! I'm opening it with my bare hands, brother guy. That video is on our channel Deep Sky Videos, and over on Objectivity we'll be showing you the Pope's meteorites and this piece of the moon. So there you have it, people, a scientifically boring piece of moon rock. All sorts of interesting things in the Vatican Observatory's collection. There are links on the screen and of course in the video description.